It's been 20 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. They were socialists. They proudly called themselves socialists.
Yeah.
In those 20 years, we've had a whole generation grow up, and they haven't learned what real communism, socialism, collectivism
the Red
is.
Scare hasn't been around for a couple of decades.
And a lot of people who used to be socialists have now morphed into other ideologies. For example, environmentalists. Environmentalists, through whether it's global warming regulation or something else, also want to control the economy. They want to regulate everything. I call them watermelons. They're green on the outside, but what they really are is red on the inside.
If I were president, I would ecologize the economy. I think it's the most sweeping campaign that we need to have, the most transformative, the most revolutionary, and the most long-lasted, and it would solve multiple problems all at once. So let me tell you what I mean by that really quickly.
Okay.
Right? What capitalism does poorly is it doesn't look at the carrying capacity of Mother Nature. We need to transform the capitalism economy into something that respects the cycles of nature. Now, whether capitalism is the right economic system for the next 1,000 years, I suspect not. But right now we have no choice but to do great changes with it.
Few people ever truly give up power voluntarily. It needs to actually be taken from them. It doesn't need to be taken violently, but it needs to be taken. It's not a true power unless we've actually earned it and taken it from the grassroots.
Nearly everything that RAND does is based on masses of people taking action to let corporations know that business as usual is just not okay. We have folks in the organization who are going in and negotiating with the CEOs of these companies, and the CEOs know that there's people outside that are getting really angry, and that puts a certain amount of pressure on them to do the right thing.
That we'll be able to really reframe environmentalism in a way that's a lot more effective and a lot more appealing to a huge, broad range of people. And
popular movements and people's movements rise up to change, the face of our nation. We practice solidarity with other groups who are struggling for power within their own context.
The cost to Mexico is just a tremendous amount of cost, millions of dollars. If we want to keep our economy going like we're doing, the standard of living we want to do, we need to be producing gas in Otero Mesa, because Otero Mesa is not that pristine area that you say it is. There's really no trees out there. There's no ponderosa pines. There's no elk. There's a bombing range entirely down one side of it. There's radio antennas out there, miles and miles of pipelines. There's miles and miles of transmission lines, and there's over 100 wells have been dug in the 50s and 60s, mainly looking for oil. And I think all they found was natural gas. That's why I want to go back in there and try to get that natural gas. So it's what's at stake here really is we're talking about like 500 jobs, 400 jobs in the initial drilling phase, and in the permanent production phase, probably another 100 jobs. And annual income to the state land office be anywhere from $3 to $5 million per year, and we feel like the annual income to New Mexico, throughout New Mexico, around 30 to 40 million a year. So it just seems like they just want to take a piece of land, set it out there, not to be able to do anything with it, any kind of production. And the next step will be is you can't go in there. You can only stand back miles and look at it. You won't even be able to get in there.
The impact they've had is, if you consider that the ag community controls about 80% of the water and operates over close to 90% of the land, then what the environmentalists have done is discriminated against the ag producers more than any other group. And as a result, these large farms have come in and the corporate farms have come in. So they've even changed the face of agriculture in New Mexico. And if you look carefully at this, you'll see that the largest impact they've had has been in those counties where there's a large federal landmass. And a good example of that would be in northern New Mexico and the impact environmental policies have had up there. What the power brokers and the feds didn't take away from the Hispanic farmers and ranchers in northern New Mexico early on, the environmentalists have been taking away from them since the 1970s. And they've used the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the pesticide laws, and federal grazing and grazing management type laws. They've used those to remove these ranchers. And then this has an impact on the local community. For instance, if a rancher has to move away because of environmental policies, then he no longer lives in that community. His children are no longer in the school district. And so the impacts keep reverberating and doing damage to that local community.
The environmental movement today is a very debilitating force in our society. If you want to point to the Gila as an example, in 1960, there were some 24 active forest allotments, either in the wilderness core or along that core. By the late 1980s, 12 of those had been fully destocked and the others had been reduced about 87%. Environmental pressures, in large part, and forest management made that happen. And also this issue that we'll learn more about as time goes on, and it's the balance of an industry at equilibrium. And when you start messing with that balance, and when you start tweaking it and artificially and adjusting it, momentum is lost, participants and entry of new participants diminishes, and aging characteristics set in. The environmental movement has done that to many industries, and certainly the so-called extractive industries that once existed in the West. Livestock, mining, timber operations, and what a loss that has been, and ultimately what a shame that will be. I think those of us in the West will be thinking, what makes us different? Why do we have to continue to operate with one hand tied behind our backs when our colleagues elsewhere have full latitude? The environmental movement has had effect on that.
Wilderness and enforcement are not compatible.
Why is that? I don't understand.
Well, the definition of wilderness means that those people charged with enforcing immigration laws on the border are not permitted on those lands. And no one else is either except the administrators of those lands. Often when an area is designated as wilderness, that same legislation that permits that designation revokes the authority of Homeland Security officers to do their job. If S 1689 is ultimately passed, that 25-mile stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border is designated wilderness. It'll just be a giant gap, a corridor for smugglers that will be so tempting. We have to know from experience that it'll be utilized and fully utilized by the people who would do our country wrong.
It hasn't worked in Arizona. Right. It hasn't worked in the Boot Hill of New Mexico, and certainly we're seeing an escalation of that today, all up and down the border, from Fort Hancock to Brownsville, and the ongoing catastrophe that we see in the Boot Hill of New Mexico. No objective, forward-thinking, rational leader can support border wilderness at this time on the American border. American security is more important than an environmental movement on the American border.